Hi everyone, welcome to our Utopi Lunch and Learn. For those who are on the link already, we're just going to wait maybe 1 or 2 minutes just for the rest of our registrations to come on board. So we'll kick off in a few minutes. Okay, we've got a few people on the call, so we might just kick off now. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Utopi Lunch and Learn. The session today is called From Awareness to Action, Unlocking Sustainable Student Behaviours. As always, we're absolutely thrilled to have you here, and we appreciate you giving us an hour of your time today. This is a particularly exciting session, not just because of our great guest speakers, but this is also the first session that our audience actually voted for. So we opened it up to the industry to ask what topics that they'd want to see discussed, and people came back and said resident engagement. So we're thrilled to have this session today. Before we kick off and before I introduce our brilliant guest speakers, I just want to go through a couple of housekeeping things. First and foremost, it is being recorded today, so please feel free if you're uncomfortable with that to turn your camera off, but the whole session will be recorded. We'll also have a Q&A at the end of the session, the last probably 10-15 minutes. So you'll see on the session that there's a Q&A kind of comment box. Please feel free to write in any questions or any comments that you've got through the session. And when we get to the Q&A section, I'll be using those questions to kick off for whether it's for Utopi or for our guest speakers. If you think of any questions tomorrow or in a week's time, please feel free to email them through to us. We can make sure that our guest speakers get them, or we can also share their contact information if you want to dig into a bit more detail. But as I say, the final 10 minutes will be that Q&A. Right, so today's agenda, so you know what to expect. We will be kicking off today's session with a Q&A with the brilliant Stuart Henderson, Managing Director at Luna Students. He's a very well-known name in the PBSA market, very well respected. So we're thrilled to have Stuart here and going through a bit more on Luna's work with resident experience, resident engagement, what's worked, some things that maybe haven't worked. I will then be digging into some data stories. So we've got 3 data stories to take you through from UK PBSA assets. They've got a very strong resident engagement narrative to them, and that should bring to life some of the topics that myself and Stuart will be talking about. I'll then be very proud to hand over to Saket Rao. He is a senior behavioural scientist, and he'll be taking us through the role of behavioural science. I wanted to make sure today that, as always, we have the industry voice, but I also wanted to bring in the scientific voice as well. We, as a market, talk about resident engagement a lot, but I also think, even just from myself, there's so much more that we can learn. So I think you'll get quite a lot of takeaways today, some maybe low-hanging fruit to implement into your own resident engagement strategies. But yeah, Saket will be taking us through how people act and react, why we act and react, and some of the science behind the behaviours, which is really exciting. And then, as I say, we'll dig into the Q&A as well. So before we kick things off, I really would love to introduce our guest speakers. I'll let them say a few words about themselves. But first of all, we have Stuart Henderson, Managing Director at Luna Students. Stuart, would you like to say a bit about yourself?
Yes, thank you, Chanel. Good morning, or good afternoon now. Sorry, everyone. Stuart Henderson. I work at Luna. Luna is a third-party operator of PBSA and entering the build-to-rent space this year as well. We're part of the Torsion Group, which kind of has a invest, construct and develop functions already in play, and then we manage on their portfolio for them as well. We've currently got 1,000 units under management across the UK, and we're looking to grow that over the coming months with that kind of marketing first approach that we've put in, given the kind of current marketplace we're in now in the country. So very resident focused, very people focused business.
Awesome. Thank you, Stuart. Thank you for being here. And then we've got Saket Rao, Senior Behavioural Scientist at HRW. Saket, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Saket Rao. I'm a behavioral scientist and insight strategist with close to 10 years of experience working and applying behavioral science in both the healthcare and finance domain. I have a real passion for understanding why human beings do what they do. And I kind of look to translate these complex human decision making into clear, actionable insights. So, really looking forward to walking you through some behavioral science insights today.
Thank you, Saket. Yeah, we're thrilled to have you here as well. So a bit about myself. Hi, everyone. I'm Chanel. I'm Head of Marketing at Utopi. I've been with Utopi for 3 years now. Been a big part of the growth journey that we've been on since I started, which is very exciting. And resident engagement is a big part of what a lot of us at Utopia are really passionate about. Number one, because you get direct feedback from the impact of what we do, not just on the sustainability side, but also on, I guess, aiding in the experience and what's a really important part of these residents' lives. So yeah, thrilled to be hosting the session today. But without further ado, I will kick off our Q&A with Stuart. So Stuart, thank you again for being here. I think talking about your experience will be really, really valuable. So if we could kick off with your perspective on resident experience. So Luna are often cited for putting resident experience at the heart of your strategy, but how do you personally define what great looks like when it comes to resident experience in today's PBSA market, and how has that definition maybe evolved over the last few years?
I think this can be either one of the simplest things to do or one of the trickiest things to do in terms of that definition of it. I think if you want to go with a kind of simple approach, it's got to be somewhere where people feel comfortable, supported, respected, and it's about delivering somewhere where they live, right? It's delivering a home. And I think that's something that the build to rent market is probably captured in terms of framing better than PBSA. And PBSA has been a long time talking about this. But I think it's one of these things that you turn around and go, it could be really simple. And it used to be really looked at in terms of, your rebooker stats would sit here and tell you that you must have a great resident experience if people decide to give you more than 1 year of their university studies. I think as PBSA has evolved and especially new development PBSA at the moment, at the rental prices that we've started hitting across the markets, with the inability to deliver a lot more PBSA. We know supply chains have certainly, supply lines, sorry, have certainly slowed down over recent years. Comes back to you're now attracting much more of a postgraduate market. You're now looking at different types of students coming in, and actually what they're looking for, you can't just use a simple rebooker number and go, that means we deliver a great experience. So I think really what you're looking for is great survey results that come in that tell you that. But what we've kind of found is student accommodation has become something that was always delivered a lot for international students. It primarily came in, albeit we used to have a lot more domestic students than currently what we experience at the moment. No student is just the same. You can't just turn around and say, we're student accommodation, this is the experience, or we're at this particular rental point, and so this is the experience that we have to deliver. Student accommodation experience has always been about making sure that you're catering for all of your residents. And we used to talk about that in terms of putting on events that we'd all expect to see in PBSAs. But it wouldn't matter. You used to then say, okay, well, how many people have attended? Have 50 people attended? Have 100 people attended? Sometimes it was the events you were putting on for 1 or 2 people that actually mattered most when we think about the welfare impacts and that we have to consider when working in PBSA. So I think it's quite difficult actually when you get into, it's not just looking at that rebooker stat now. There's a lot more to look at, but I think the common theme that when you think about it over all the years, it comes down to the people that are living there. No operator can turn down and say that we have a great resident experience just purely based on what they focus on or what the framework is. They need the people in the buildings to actually deliver to that framework and understand what the residents are looking for and build those connections that PBSA operators and right across the board have been so good at over the last kind of 10, 15 years. So yeah, difficult one to define. but I think it's something that as a sector, we've always been forward-looking and looking to enhance it. And I think now it's become more difficult to enhance, but it's making sure you deliver the value for the money now that people are expecting, as well as making sure that comfort and home feeling exists.
Yep. Yep, that's such a good point, actually. And it feeds really well into our next question. And I promise we didn't choreograph that. But when you're talking about operators and the kind of responsibility that they have beyond just the accommodation, so you mentioned welfare there, what other responsibility do you think operators have when it comes to well-being, sustainability, but also educating your residents as well?
You're huge, and I think that's go back to understanding who that resident is. That resident is here at a time of their life where they're spending a lot of money, whether it's on their tuition, their travel, their just cost of living, their accommodation, whatever it may be, that they need to feel value for it, and they're here at a time in their life where they're looking to learn, and that's why effectively they're coming to university. And I think, I think sometimes we can be quite fast to, we've talked about the different generations coming through over the last few years, whether it's, Gen Alpha, Gen Z, all the different ways, and we don't drink as much, we don't do this, we don't do that, and we really kind of want to get into the trends. But again, it goes back to the truth there doesn't exist for everyone. There are students that will come to university because they see it as the rite of passage and all the things that they look to do. Then there are those that are spending thousands and thousands to travel across the world to come to a Russell Group university and have that experience that they're looking for. So back to understanding what they're actually looking for. But I think then you kind of go back to provide that value for their rent, provide that well-being and safety, because it's the first thing that it's still and we would never allow in this sector to talk about kids as students, but parents are absolutely a customer of that when they are still looking at it as their kid, not a kid in our residence, but it's their kid that they're sending, that it's so important for them to know that they're safe and that there's support mechanisms in place, and it's something that operators are conscious of, and you've got the right processes and right indicators there to try and prevent rather than just react. So making sure that you've got these things in place to be able to do that. But then I also think there's a growing trend that we've all spoken about over years, which is to do with the environment and sustainability as well as operators, and that can be our responsibility to the environment, the planet. It could also be the responsibility to our clients in terms of managing their operating expenditure, as well as kind of engaging with a growing desire amongst our customers and our students that want to do better for the environment. And I think that comes back to that education bit of not just putting on, we think about the community events you put on, they shouldn't all just be for social. They should be delivering different pillars across that kind of framework that you might have in place, so that everyone gets something out of it that isn't just a kind of social, but back to that they're here to learn. We are not lecturers, we're not tutors, they're not signed up for that. But what can we do that provides a differential and an opportunity for them within the place where, let's be honest, they're spending the majority of their time? And I think that's something, again, we trigger onto, university isn't 40-hour weeks like going to work. But even if it was, they're still spending the majority of that time in your residence, whether it's sleeping or whether it's engaging in your amenity spaces or engaging with your teams. So I think it's something that you're critical of, is shouldn't accommodation play such an important part in kind of those years of occupancy in them. And I think it's a real advantage that PBSA has over HMO markets and other options that students have as well.
Yeah, you briefly mentioned there, doing the events, not just for the social side, but, maybe having a purpose to them. And I know we've discussed a few times about, the kind of things that Luna have done on that side when it comes to engaging residents. And I know that you've actually tried certain things when it comes to nudging behavioural change. So adding to that, could you talk us through what you have tried before when it comes to educating your residents, and what kind of, nudges of that behavioural change you've tried and what's actually worked best for you?
So I think over time, whether it's been Luna or previous businesses, and what a lot of operators be familiar with will be, one-off campaigns and things like that aren't necessarily the best success measures. I think this is about trying to build something into your brand effectively that can make it a little bit more interesting. but you've got to be able to back it up. And that's something that our customers are so conscious of, is not just putting out a measure and not there. But I think that's something that we would like to work towards from an acquisition point of view, in terms of our marketing and being associated with doing things a little bit differently or a little bit better. So, because actually, if you've got people that are buying into your brand to come and live with you because of a certain experience or a certain ability or opportunity, then it's a great marketing tool that not only reduces, that helps someone on some of those operational costs, but the kind of cost of acquisition of bringing them in from a marketing perspective, there's a great tool to that as well. I think part of that, though, that becomes absolutely critical is partnerships. So good examples of things that you're doing then is can you work with different partners that are like-minded, that is bringing in actual expertise in, and that's when you can start to offer real value to residents, because it's not just the fantastic people that you've got working in your building whose job it is to deliver that service and look after them and do all the things that we've touched on, but actually going and working with different partners. We had a good example of that with some work that we did with you guys at Utopi at one of our asset just before Christmas, where it was a nice kind of event that was on around kind of Christmas baubles and crafts and stuff like that, but there was some great messaging coming in that was associated with obviously part of the Utopi product and how that's been used and making people feel a bit more comfortable and build a little bit more trust into it in terms of what we're trying to do with that. So I think ultimately it's about trying to deliver events that are what residents want, and that can come back to, it might be a social event with a message that's carried through, but kind of where I'm getting at with that is if you can actually attach it to your brand, so it's not something that's just been sprung upon them, has come in and all of a sudden that you now care about the environment or you care about whatever else it might be, that you're actually attracting someone that's already open to that. And I think from a very general level, we go back to that idea of they're here to learn, they're here to study. This is something that will hopefully be of interest to them, but you've got to deliver that in different ways. So it's a kind of consistent message delivered in different ways to kind of meet the wants of all the different personalities that you'll have in your building. So that might be having that kind of message going through in a craft event, but then it might also have to go through in a different type of event that attracts a different type of person to it. But you've got a constant theme of it's not just a one-off, it's consistent throughout time, and it shows that it's something that you're investing in, and it probably goes back to that needing the people in the building to believe in that as well. So how do we make student accommodation a little bit more interesting? We'll be general managers and property staff that have worked for different operators right across the board and forged really good careers in this sector. How do you make their job a little bit more interesting? Because actually, if you can invest in those people in the buildings, that's how you're really going to deliver a different or a better experience for those residents.
Mm-hmm. And even when getting, you talk about making sure residents are kind of engaged with it, maybe even before they move in. I mean, do you also find off the back of that you do it as part of like induction packs, or if it has to feed into your brand overall, I guess those kind of comms start even before the residents even moved in?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's trying to then feed it in different ways into that marketing. And that's still something that we're working at and trying to get better at. Because it's got to be subtle. You don't want to also be we're not operating in a world here where you can be really picky about who your customer is. So it's got to be subtle, that it will work for people that are looking for that idea. But it's also then getting them that idea of what was the experience going to be like. And I think that's something that students are always looking for when they've got options on where to live, trying to kind of do that. So you can do that through whether it's taking all the stuff that everyone will do in terms of photos or videos of events, but you're dead right, getting that into handbooks, getting that into other types of marketing, getting that into other communications you're doing with people. And it might even be going back to something like your website. And this isn't something that we've implemented, but you have a dark mode on your website that allows people to kind of use less energy on when they just go on, and that kind of sets it right from the off and going, oh, wait a minute, this is a business that's a little bit different. So I think there's so many ways that people can do that. And then it's about, okay, all the messaging is great and that attracts them to that customer. But then when they arrive at your building, your teams become, again, that critical cog in the machine to actually deliver it. Because how disappointing is it when you think you're buying something for a particular reason and then it doesn't come to life? And that's when you talk about that great experience and those feedback and surveys. And yeah, that's when it becomes a real negative for a business. So having to deliver it becomes critical on top of the messaging.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense that those site teams are such an anchor for that. So on that side, I know you've mentioned to me before, kind of operational KPIs that you have, but also trying to make sure that you maximize the investment in tools like Utopi, but also any other tech that you might have or other things on site. Do you put in place targets specifically for resident engagement to make sure that that is something that maximizes investment?
I would say we look at trends more than targets, and kind of looking at some of those exceptions and not wanting to put pressure on it, but making a very strong awareness of it. So it might even be, if you want to use energy consumption as a good example of that, we don't sit down with teams and say you've got to be X amount of kilowatt hours in a particular month or over a year. But what we do set is kind of looking for that kind of target, is going, can we reduce consumption year on year? As just as a starter. And really the way that we look at that, we've kind of got a model within Luna we talk about is reduce, invest. So we look at how do we reduce our energy consumption for all the reasons that we've touched on already in this chat. We look at how do we reduce that cost of acquisition, and that can be through different measures, of course, but really these are the two metrics that we've seen over the last, if you go back kind of pre-Ukraine war and the energy markets blowing up and how difficult now we look at marketing for residents. These are the two things within your OPEX that have absolutely increased over the last kind of 5-6 years. So how do we really target and focus that? And then actually it's about any benefits of it. How do we reinvest that in the people? Because you go back to tools such as Utopi and other tools that we'll look to put in, you can put in the investment in the hardware, but your operator then becomes absolutely critical to the success of these tools. Data is fantastic if you do something about it. So it's that ability of having to do it. But if you think about some of the ability to, it's timing. It comes back to PBSA teams are as small as they have ever been because of these growing pressures on your OPEX and the kind of other nominals that we've spoken about. So how do we really work on freeing them up to focus on it and then start setting them off as part of their employment and onboarding? This is what's important to us as a brand. Really important is that we're thinking about the environment and we're trying to do what we can do to reduce that consumption. We really care about the experience and what we can do to try and reduce that cost of acquisition. And from that, we'll deliver a better service all rounded and we believe also a better NOI to our clients.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. You actually mentioned data before, which is perfect because I'm keen to ask you something around technology and data. So we obviously know that engaging residents, it does go beyond comfort and sustainability. I know we talk about welfare a lot, but have you seen data used in the right way when it helps improve, or has it helped improve resident experience and helped improve comfort?
Yes, absolutely. And I think one of the big things I think for myself was a huge success of this was when I went into a building recently, one of our buildings in Leeds, and the manager was sat in the office, and on the screen there was the Utopi platform, and I was like, brilliant, okay, our messaging is getting through, and that's something that I hadn't seen when I kind of first joined. So we kind of seen that, and I'm kind of like, okay, brilliant, sit me down and take me through what you seeing here, show me how you're using the data.
Love this.
I get so excited by it. I was like, brilliant, here we can actually get into some of the stuff that's different from than what we would do. And the managers kind of was taking me through what they were kind of seeing, all the stuff you can see in terms of weird outliers. But they straight away went to a room that was proper blue on the map.
Yeah.
And just like, look, this room was at 9 degrees, and this was kind of November time, so temperatures had really started to take a dip, and we're going, okay, let's just what else can we see from the data in that example? So went in and they could see, well, look, somebody went into the room last night, and since then we haven't actually seen any movement. So straight away you've got a kind of welfare thing, and that was kind of a way that I don't think. And I won't speak for you guys at Utopi or anyone else that's got tech like that. I don't think that was one of the first things that was thought of when we're putting in temperature. I think we always go straight to that consumption idea. But the way that operators and PBSA think differently is they straight away went to, we've got a potential welfare thing here, and they went up and they went to knock. Now, thankfully, good news story. There was no one in the room, and I think all that happened was the movement had stopped. They'd opened the door previously. They'd opened the window because they cooked their dinner, and then they went away to their boyfriend or girlfriends for the night and hadn't returned.
Wow.
And that's great for us going. We don't then have to overstep the mark. Now, you could go in, you can maybe close the window, and people then start having that balance and trade off. Going, is that overstepping? What are you trying to do here? But actually, we go back to fundamentally, we were able to use the tool completely differently. But we were only able to get access to that data because we've started to build that culture into the teams that you've got tech. How do you use it? And I think then that comes through on how you use it is then how you start thinking about trust and transparency and things like that with your residents, but also with your teams. And I think that's something that operational teams, they can end up being a little bit done to. And what I mean by that is that they are not out speaking to different tech platforms or what they're trying to do. And actually, sometimes it might be a client, an investor that wants to go and invest in the tech, an asset manager for these reasons that there's a reduction in cost or whatever they're looking to do. Having the operator really bought into what that aim of that is actually then looks at how's the tool used practically. And I think that was just a really good example of not just trying to look at reduced consumption, but actually using it in a different way and showing the benefit of data when you've got time to actually look at it.
Yep. Yeah, no, that makes total sense and feeds well into the data stories that I'll be taking us through in a moment on, when you've got the granular room level insight that the right quality data, you really can learn so much about behaviours and what's going on in your assets. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to try and combine the next two questions if possible, because I know we were going to mention, the fact that you're rolling out the Utopi Spaceflow app. So I wanted to know a little bit more about what problem you were trying to solve by bringing in new technologies like that, specifically why now felt like the right time to invest in that kind of app, but then also bringing in this idea of trust, which you actually mentioned earlier, and how important that trust can be when you're implementing any type of smart technology, especially when you're trying to engage residents. And as you say, site teams might not be the ones signing off the tech, but residents also aren't. So how have you found that the app process and solving those problems? And then how do you deal with the trust issue in practice with that kind of technology?
So that would be exactly that reason was why we chose to go down that route. And I think it's the ability of giving that transparency and what is it we're looking at, why we're interested at it, I think can actually become a much more powerful tool than someone going in and wondering what the thing in the roof is and what does it actually do and why are you looking at this. So I think having to be really transparent is important in that, and I think then it takes it to the first level. So if you look at just having maybe the sensors in the room that you've just got some data, we'll be able to display that data to a resident on their own usage. Factored that in with the communication, the messaging, all the stuff that's going on all year round and not one-off, actually builds a general awareness and hopefully a care. And it won't be for everyone, and that's you've got to be very clear on that. But for some people, if you can continue that education around why we're giving it, hopefully provides a kind of care and a desire then to participate in what we're trying to do as a whole kind of community and team. So I think the ability to give that in first and foremost was the big thing, and then obviously you get the gamification benefits and all the things you can actually do to try and support some of those campaigns that will ultimately look to change some of that behaviour. But then I also think from a kind of secondary point of view, and I touched on it at the start, we know that there's an affordability challenge with student accommodation at the moment. We know that people are paying more and more for their rent and for all the other things associated with being a student. And if you think about in your own home, now, it would be very common for a lot of people to have some sort of tool that allows them to control, boost their heating, or some sort of comfort level that has it ready for them. People in student accommodation are paying as much, if not more, in some cases for their rental cost of living. Why are we not giving them some of that tool and ability to do it? And that comes with that trust and transparency of what they're going to do. You've still got a control measure around it, with the cap on how high the heater can go or whatever it may be, but actually to give them something better. How do we deliver better value for them? We touched on at the start for that rent. And I just think that's a great step there. If someone's paying a high rent to be able to come out of university, know they're heading back to their apartment, to be able to boost their heating so when they get in, it's comfortable for them. So I think there's two parts. One is about the reduction, but it's not just about reduction. And we've got to be very careful that we don't just all come about is reducing that energy cost. It comes about also impacting that cost of acquisition. So making it comfortable for them to want to stay and have a great experience in your property is a massive consideration in that. And just to finish it off, and you go back to trust. If they've got the control and they've got access to the same information, they're far more trusting in what you're trying to do. And I think it's really about not breaching that trust with some of the data that you might have access to, which goes back to that 9 degrees example. Would it be a breach of trust to go in there and close the window? Or actually, is it a good welfare, good service that actually they're going to come back and the room's not going to be freezing to do it? That's up for debate. Yeah,
it's a fine line, isn't it? Perfect. So last question. It's been so good to hear about, your experiences and your kind of mindset when it comes to this stuff. We thought it'd be good to end with maybe what hasn't worked. As an industry, we talk a lot about successes, but there is a lot of testing and iterating as well. So what have you learnt doesn't meaningfully influence behaviour, despite obviously having the best of intentions?
Yeah, well, I think it's a great way of looking at it. Good intentions don't always equal impact. So it really has to become a key part of your mantra, your way of doing things, and what you want to be associated about. So it comes right down to your recruitment and getting people in that are interested. And I think the other bit is going that the information and education bit of it alone won't shift the habits. So it's got to be a lot about what the environment you're in will shape that behaviour far more than reminders will do. And having systems in place that will kind of outperform that messaging. But for me, they go hand in hand. So it's not going to be one-off campaigns. It's not going to be a poster or just a reminder. Go back to what is it you're trying to achieve? How do you build that into something bigger? And say that's got to be part of your messaging and what your brand is associated with, and then ultimately having the people in place that matter. Because as we said, as we started the conversation, you can have a brand that's fully set up for everything about environmental or sustainable or welfare, whatever you want that messaging to be. If the people working in the building aren't bought into it, it won't work. So the people, as everything tends to come back to in PBSA, the people working in the buildings become the most important asset, and they need to be tied into what your strategy is and what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. Thank you so much, Stuart. I actually wish I could keep asking you a million more questions, and I'm sure our audience feel the same. But yeah, thank you very much for being on the call. And if anybody's got any questions to ask Stuart, please pop them in the Q&A box and we can kick those off when the Q&A starts.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to, as I mentioned earlier, bring some of these areas to life that Stuart's mentioned, things like having access to data, why having the right people in the building helping, deal with the resident engagement. And so I've got 3 data stories to take you through. They are very granular data stories based on one space alone, and hopefully they depict a picture for, if this can be controlled at a room level, the kind of impact that can be made across a whole asset or a whole portfolio if you get that resident engagement right. So first one, we're calling it DIY climate control. Now, one of our clients was using the Utopi platform and they were alerted to a space that was consuming 20 kilowatt hours, just one space alone. Now, for reference here, the average UK home is the average should be 8 kilowatt hours a day. And for the average UK home, that's considered 2 to 3 bedrooms. So one space alone consuming 20 kilowatt hours a day is really significant. When the site team went and knocked on the door, they found what we call a rogue heater, but we know that this is a really common point of discussion in the PBSA market at the moment. It's these external heating devices or an additional plug-in heater, basically. They're huge consumers, huge generators of energy waste. This one space alone, in going and knocking on the door, spoke to the resident. They were able to engage with them in a couple of different ways. Number one, they wanted to communicate with the resident about their environmental journey. So, why they were, hoping that external heater might not be plugged in, but also helping educate them on the use of the smart device that was in the room, making sure that they understood why it turned off when they weren't in the room, why there were maximum temperatures, that kind of thing. So in this instance, you can see here, top right-hand corner, that line is where the resident has been engaged, and then you see a significant drop. I believe it was about 15 kilowatt hours, about a 50% reduction, a 57% reduction. So you can see here there's one day that there's a big spike. That might have been a particularly cold day, but overall they had agreed to stop using that rogue heater. And the reason why I wanted to start with this is, number one, I know it's quite a hot topic in the market of how common it is, but showing the kind of granularity of, you know, yes, this would have cost them £580 across a heating season. But when you're considering that one asset might have 200, 300 beds and there might be 20 or 30 rogue heaters in one asset alone, you can start to see how that adds up in terms of cost, also in terms of energy consumption, and why, yeah, if you can get that resident engagement right, it can have a real effect at scale across your assets. Right, next one. This, I almost fell off my chair when I saw this. This is a relatively new data story that we found. We're calling it bedroom or battery station. So just a bit of context, the average UK home consumes 8 kilowatt hours a day. Again, that's 2 to 3 beds. This one studio was consuming 61 kilowatt hours a day. As you can imagine, when our client found this on the Utopi platform, they, you know, immediately went up and knocked on the door just to make sure that, number one, health and safety, what was going on in that space, and just to see exactly what was going on. In this particular instance, they were using almost all of the room outlets to charge power tools. Now, charging power tools is unusual, obviously, in student accommodation, but the idea of charging devices and charging technology is actually a very common behaviour, which is why I wanted to bring this in today. So, you know, if it went unnoticed, that would have cost them over £1,500 across a 200-day heating season, would have cost them over 684 kilograms of carbon. But it's also a bit of real-world context. What that space was consuming is enough energy for a petrol vehicle to drive the length of the United Kingdom 3 times. So you can see how just one space alone can have such an impact across an asset, across a site, across a portfolio. And as I say, if you can get that engagement right, in this instance, the resident did agree to reduce their use of the devices, but I believe it only dropped 15 kilowatt hours a day. So it was still a really, really significant consumer of energy. And when we bring in the topics of all-inclusive rental models, you know, making sure that that resident engagement is done right to hopefully cover some of those bases becomes so important. And then lucky last, if anybody's been at any of my talks recently, I always bring this one up because I also find it particularly shocking. But we call it entrepreneurial spirit, or in other words, when residents go rogue. So our customer impact team do monthly checks for client sites just to make sure everything's working. They check the heat map and everything else, but they were alerted to this space because it was consuming 1,200% more energy than the site average. So as you can imagine, the site team were particularly concerned when they were informed of this. They went and knocked on the door. This particular instance was Bitcoin mining, hence the entrepreneurial spirit theme here. So they were consuming 50 kilowatt hours a day. You can see here the blue line where they were engaged, and you see a significant drop in their usage. But the reason why I tend to use this data story in the context of resident engagement is this resident actually didn't agree to change their behaviours. They agreed to compromise, but they didn't agree to change it. So what they said was, I believe it was 3 or 4 servers running 24/7 initially. They said, look, I won't use the servers when I'm not in the room, but I'll continue to mine for Bitcoin when I am in the room. So it did see a huge drop of 27 kilowatt hours per day. And yes, that would have saved them over $3,000 across the 200-day heating season. But I think it brings to life, yes, the granularity, that room level insight is so important, having the right data behind you. But as Stuart mentioned, without the right teams there really, you know, stressing that message, or without the right kind of branding and marketing and messaging before students move in, the all-inclusive rental model can make things a bit tough as well. Then it can be really hard, and it can have a big effect on, yes, on energy, on cost. But I think that kind of brings to life why this stuff is so important. Perfect. Right. So enough of me. I've sped through that to try and give Saket even more time, because I think, you know, there'll be a lot to learn from what Saket's going to take us through. So this next section, the role of behavioural science. Saket, take it away.
Thank you. We'll move on to the next slide. And I just want to say that we've seen some really clear data patterns from the data stories that Chinnan has spoken about. And mostly what data often tends to tell us is what is happening and when it's happening. But what data can't always tell us on its own is why those patterns exist. And that's where a behavioral lens can be useful, not to replace any of the data, but just to help interpret it. So for the next few minutes, I'll share how behavioral science helps connect those dots. Before I do, on the next slide, what I'd like you to do is just to have a look at this one question. Which would influence you more? Please follow the building guidelines, or most people in this building follow the guidelines. So what's interesting here is that the information didn't really change. One is a request and the other is a statement, but both convey the same idea. It's just the framing that has kind of changed overall, and yet it likely influenced your reaction to this question. So similarly, when we see patterns like this in data, the question becomes, what's really driving them? So let's look at what data might be telling us on the next slide. So what we see in the data is that engagement changes over the day. Behavior doesn't always match intent. And here, the behavior questions that this raises is what's different for students in these moments and what's making some of these actions easier or harder. So instead of asking, how do we get students to care more, it's about understanding, using behavioral science, what's different about the context and when does this behavior really happen. And that shift in question usually leads to different solutions. So having started off, let me kind of talk to you about what is behavioral science on the next slide. So behavioral science is a way of understanding decisions in real world conditions. A lot of psychology and economics often stem from this idea that human beings are very much rational in the way that they think. But behavioral science starts from the assumption that no, they're quite erratic, and we as humans are rather irrational. And so it assumes people are well-intentioned, but they're quite busy. We are busy, and we're very much influenced by context. And that's what we mean by saying, well, life really happens, and we aren't that rational when we think about it. So let me try to break this down a little further. So on the next slide, I'm going to be talking to you about just these two words on the screen here. One is intention, the other is action. So most people, including students, don't wake up intending to do the wrong thing. But somewhere between intention and action, that's where real life happens. That's where behavior often breaks down. So behavioral science often spends a lot of time trying to understand what shows up in that space and why people do what they do. So I've probably spoken to you a lot so far about data, about understanding behavioral science and decisions, but let me give you something more concrete now. So on the next slide, I'm going to talk to you about what tends to get in the way. So first up, there's this element called friction. These are things like small barriers and extra steps. Now, to give you a real world example of this, imagine that your New Year resolution for 2026 is to get fitter and healthier, and therefore you want to go and join a gym. As a result of the joining process, there are around 30 different paperwork and forms that you now have to fill. Your intention is to go to the gym and get healthier, but suddenly there are these small barriers or extra steps called friction in the form of 30 new pages to fill out. And as a result, your end action is going to get compromised. And that is one of the elements that tends to get in the way. The other is cognitive load. It's very simple for me to say cognitive load, but in reality, it's about when life is busy or tiring. If you don't believe me, just think about what you had last night for dinner. Is that decision something that you've taken out of your own conscious choice, or was that influenced because you had a long day at work, or you had some other moments or life moments to attend to? And that's the idea behind cognitive load. So interestingly, neither is about motivation. It's about the environment and contextual factors. We'll take a look at this in a bit more detail through another example on the next slide. So when I was pursuing my master's in behavioral science, living in a student accommodation, I wanted to understand why my own behaviors in terms of recycling were varying at different points in the week. I wanted to understand that I have the motivation to recycle, and I really wanted to understand why I was finding it to be rather difficult at certain points. Let's take two scenarios. One is a Monday morning at 8 o'clock. Just had a bowl of cereal, have a carton of milk. I'm ready to recycle it. I'm able to read the instructions. I'm able to look at the signage that the student accommodation has put up. I'm able to recycle it, rinse it, and then put it in the right recycling bin. Now, fast forward to say Thursday evening, had 4 hours of classes, 3 assignments, and I'm preparing for an exam for next week. It's around 8 p.m. Thanks to cognitive load, I have gotten takeout instead of cooking something healthy. But suddenly I'm looking at the container now and looking at all the steps. I'm now looking at the signage that the student accommodation has put out, and my mind goes blank. I have no idea how to recycle this, right? The education is there. The information is in front of me. All of the things are in place. But why is it that 8 o'clock on Monday versus 8 p.m. on a Thursday has such a huge impact, and why is it that I'm unable to do it? So I've written a whole paper about it just to understand how cognitive load and the timing of the day really impacts our behavior overall. So if cognitive load and timing matter that much in a relatively simple behavior, it's worth asking how that plays out in more complex everyday resident decisions. So we'll move on to the next slide, where I will talk a bit more about what this might mean for resident engagement, for welfare, for operational KPIs, and much more. So let's look at engagement first, right? As I spoke about my recycling paper, it really varies by time and mental bandwidth. So if you were to communicate some energy saving behaviors late evening, students are often going to be tired, they might be socializing or studying, and therefore it might impact how they receive the overall education and message. So for this, maybe testing messaging at different points in the day might be a nice way to overcome that. We'll move on to the second bit here, which is about complexity. So complexity often outweighs good intentions. Let's take an example of heating controls. So if heating controls in rooms are unclear, or if they're buried in menus and they require a couple of pages to understand, that can really overall impact the uptake and, well, their overall behavior. So here it would be about making information more clear, more salient, or giving them a frame of reference. For example, an ideal range of heating or temperatures to keep the room at during winters. We'll move to attention next, where attention being, I'm referring to how it shapes what is most visible in the moment. And in this instance, let's look at another example. Let's look at sustainability and reducing the water usage in these student accommodations. So let's say that you want to inform your students, the residents, that you want to reduce the overall water usage, and instead of having some signage, you decide to have an email sent out to everyone, and that can really overall impact that level of information and the time at which they're going to be using it. For example, if I'm going to go wash my hands, maybe the most salient information at that point is not going to be about the email, but rather what's in front of me. And therefore, having something at more eye level, or having some signage and clear icons around the tap might be a better outcome because it's more clear and it's around the action itself. Lastly, let's talk about behavior. It's a very broad thing, but here I refer to behavior as behavior being influenced by perceived peer norms or the people around us. As Stuart mentioned earlier, there's a lot of people who come down for student accommodations, and they come internationally to come and pursue. They may not have the same cultural norms that is being followed in the UK, especially in the student accommodation. So at that point of time, how do they get to understand what the norms are? At that point, they may be more likely to reach out to people who are wardens or people who are familiar with the UK culture and learn those behaviors from them, as opposed to relying on information. So is there a way for us to tackle how information is being passed down based on who is communicating. And so these are just questions for us to kind of ponder about, because I can't come here and claim that I have all of these answers, but I would rather say that these are good starting points to think about. So we'll move on to this, one of the last few slides. Here, I want to talk about one thing. So the idea is, whatever I said on the previous slide, it's really nice to hear. They're quick wins, they're easy, and they work. But do they work in your particular context? And that's what's going to be important for us to understand and to test further. So let me take one insight. Let me show you how you could possibly test it, and then what to look out for in the data. So keeping the engagement, talking about the example of recycling and different points in the day, we're looking at engagement varying by capacity, how we engage with information and educational materials. So for something like this, what we could do is we could test how it's being received by changing the time of communication at multiple points in the week. We could do certain types of research tests and kind of test these hypotheses, and that's one way for us to understand if the behavioral intervention that we've chosen is actually practical and has an impact. And so how we're able to measure that is by looking at what the data might show. So in this instance, if we were to take a power and heating related measure, we can kind of track that data by some of the KPIs that you already have. So looking at how the information that you have mentioned, how does that really impact the data overall? So these are things that you've already been doing. It's just about looking at the behavioral intervention that you can do as well. So I'm going to move on to the last slide here. And this is about turning insight into question that matters, right? The main takeaway here is really simple. The data shows you patterns. Behavioral insight explains why, and the context and testing reveals what actually works. So behavioral science doesn't give you answers, it helps you ask better questions. And the most valuable ideas usually come from combining your knowledge of the residents, the patterns that you see, a bit of behavioral science and interventions, and a lot of willingness to test and learn. We'll move on to this last slide. So here I just want to pause and say, if anything sparked your curiosity or have any ideas while I was speaking, or even any disagreement, I would love to hear about them, because that's exactly the point. That's where behavioral insight begins. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There's so much to take in there. Thank you so much. I wanted to make sure that we had Saket's email address here. I know having a behavioural scientist or a senior behavioural scientist is a very good contact to have in our market. So please feel free to jot down his Gmail account if you wanted to reach out. What we will do now is kick off the Q&A. So I will stop sharing so I can see the Q&A box. Okay, we've got the first question in. So it's a question for Stuart. What level of feedback, positive or negative, do you get from students on environmental measures and events, and how does this feed into your strategies? Great question.
Yeah, really good question. And I think, so at this point, I think it's quite low. And I think that probably goes to, I think this is a kind of growing trend or a growing direction of travel for us to go in. And I think as some of the messaging and engagement becomes stronger as we kind of progress as a brand and we attach more of that to our brand values, it's something I would expect to see. I know will increase, and then we'll take on whether it's positive or negative. And I think, you know, Saket actually touched on it there as well. It comes back to the demographic of a particular community within a building. And I think that's something that's so important when you come back to think about it, is the demographics across our buildings across the country are significantly different. And one of the things, if I can just kind of expand on top of that, because one of the things Saket said that kind of got me thinking there, comes back to the difference for me between a resident that you've got for 40 weeks or 43 or 51, maybe 2 or 3 years as they go on, and that feeling of home, versus some of the messaging that you can maybe do if you've got a much shorter term guest, which becomes a little bit more. I think I used the example there you had of washing your hands. Can the signage be there in the bathroom to do that? I had a really good example. A lot of you will know the guys at the Social Hub. They do some really great work across Europe. They stayed in one of their hotels in Amsterdam last year. So they've got great things in the showers with messaging about how long and at times how long your shower's on, so you can see. And I'm in there and I'm thinking about that, having my shower, and I turned it off. Do I want that in my home? Do I take that back to my wife and say, we're going to install these because I want us to think about it? Is probably a no. And I think that's when you go back to that, how long are you here? And I think, we started off the conversation today on what's the most important thing for a great experience. We talked about comfort and we talked about the home feeling. And I think that's where you've got to be that innovative in how you get it. But there was still so much there to learn about when you're engaging, when's it coming from. And I think that's for us as we progress as an operating business, is getting the messaging in, sometimes subtly, sometimes front and center. But I think the thing for me is consistent. And if we can keep that consistency, I would like to feel like we're going to get better feedback, better results for the environment and for clients and for our teams. Because I look at our teams really, that kind of, I talked about peers as being one of the great things, Saket, in terms of that kind of real change. We look at our teams as being part of that community. They're almost peers, and whether that's resident assistants or general managers, that consistent messaging and who we recruit becomes essential to that being consistent, I think.
Mm-hmm. Great. That feeds really well into another question we've just got through for you, Stuart, as well, in terms of the work that you've been doing at Luna. How do you gather resident feedback, and what has it told you in that feedback, and maybe how that's changed over time?
So across the sector, everyone though, there's various different platforms that you can use for kind of external surveys, which allow you to benchmark against other people across all the different areas of that you may be interested in. The data, something that's becoming more and more impressive as you kind of get years on years of coming through. Separately to that, using things like our app that we touched on earlier, or just our kind of own database, we can pulse survey. So we'll pulse survey randomly, sometimes post-event, sometimes pre-events, what type of event people are looking for. So I think that's kind of the main way that we'll get that feedback, as well as just any general touch points. We go back to that constant engagement we're looking for person to person within the buildings, and then how do we bring that back in to shape our discussions. What's it telling us? I certainly see the direction of travel, that this is a topic, and if we use sustainability then as a topic that's becoming more and more prevalent in the students that come through year on year. It certainly differs, going back to how Saket mentioned it as well, where they come from, what's their normal culture awareness there. And I think then that sometimes you can see here is it maybe takes a longer term to see a result. So Chanel touched on earlier, one of her examples, a kind of what they could do over a 200-day heating season. Sometimes that behavioural shift won't happen in that first year. Sometimes that is just not long enough. And we think about 51 weeks or however long a tenancy length could be in the sector is a long time. But what you're trying to do here is change. And I'll use myself as that example. Use the Social Hub one I talked from earlier. I stayed there probably 3 years ago, and it's in my mind. But sometimes I'll still brushing my teeth and I'll know I've left the tap on. And I want to be better at it, but it's just not ingrained in me to do. So I think it's that bit of general awareness. We'll continue to push it. I think feedback from students, what I will love to see is people then choosing our brand because they know it's something we're conscious of, we're passionate about and aware of. And ideally, we hopefully get, but we're getting that already from people rebooking with us for the next cycle. But the best thing for me, if I can start seeing that also coming externally of new bookings, people attracted to our brand because they're seeing that come through as something that we're passionate about and actually do something about.
Oh, great stuff. Well, look, we've come to the end of the session. Thank you so much, Stuart, for your answers. I'm sure there'll be many other questions. So just to reiterate, please feel free to email them through to our guest speakers directly or through ourselves. But we hope that you really enjoyed the session today. Thank you so much, Saket. Thank you so much, Stuart. It was absolutely brilliant to have you both, your experience, your point of view, your expertise. So yeah, thank you everyone for being here. We will be sharing the recording and we hope to see you all on the next Lunch and Learn. Thank you very much.